Good evening, everybody. Welcome to lesson 2 of Lambda School's mini bootcamp. So if you missed our lesson last night, which was lesson 1, that's totally okay. You will need to go back and check out the video and catch up on it in order to do the homework, but everything we're gonna learn tonight can stand on its own. So go ahead and hang out and then check out that last video from last night so you can catch up. So if anyone is joining us for the first time, let me go ahead and introduce myself. I'm Deandra Ryan Moss, and I am an instructor here at Lambda School. And Lambda School is a pretty cool thing. It is a computer science immersive. So what we do is we teach you guys web development and computer science topics. Our goal is to get you from being a beginner programmer to being hireable, and we do that over a 6-month curriculum. So everything is online. It's a full-time Monday through Friday course, and we teach you, first of all of the web development topics. So you're going to learn about front-end development, web design, back-end development, databases, frameworks, and we end that section with a big project that you work on. And then we switch focus to some more computer science-oriented topics like object-oriented programming. We talk about Python, and we go into algorithms. So it's a really well-rounded curriculum. You're going to learn a lot of practical skills and some of the more academic sciencey side of programming. And one thing that makes Lambda School extremely cool is the way we approach tuition. So while you are welcome to pay your tuition up front, we also offer a deferred program. So our idea is that we want everyone who wants to learn and is capable of learning programming to be able to do that. We don't want your lack of funds to stop you. So rather than paying tuition up front, we also have an option where you can wait until you get a job. So what you do is you pay us $0 from the get-go, you sign an income share agreement, and then once you have gotten that full-time job, so that's a full-time computer programming job making more than $50K, you'll pay us a percentage of your first 2 years' salary. And we cap that off at $30K. So even if you land the most amazing, high-powered, high-paying job in the world, we're not going to take more than $30K from you. So go ahead and apply for Lambda School if you're interested. If you're still on the fence, reach out to our admissions team and we can get you more information. And this mini bootcamp is totally free. It is our way of getting you ready for the actual bootcamp. We really look favorably in admissions on people who have taken this, so it's a great way to ensure that you'll get into the program. And even if you're not interested in our program, it's totally free, and we're happy to share our knowledge with you. So let me go ahead and talk to you guys about actual computer programming now. So tonight we are going to dive a little deeper into some web development topics. So I'm going to introduce you to 2 of the key languages for front-end web development, which is HTML and CSS. So before we go into that, let me do a quick review of what we talked about last time. So we talked about some high-level concepts at the beginning. We first talked about this idea of what is a computer programming language. Well, that's a really broad category, and as you'll even start to see just today, each language can be really different in the way that it uses syntax and keywords and what it is capable of doing. Some languages are extremely specific. Some languages are extremely broad. But the biggest takeaway is that a computer language is a certain set of syntax rules and keywords that allows us as programmers to communicate directly with the computer. We also talked about this idea of what is a code base. A code base is a collection of one or more related files of code that all work together to accomplish one thing, such as creating a web page. And we will see a code base in action tonight. And then finally, I showed you guys 2 really important tools. We introduced the terminal, which is kind of the way that we tap right into what the computer is doing. And we saw how to do some basic things like navigate folders, create new files, create new folders, delete things, all using the terminal instead of user-friendly tools like the Finder that we're used to. And then finally, I taught you some Git tools. So that's all about workflow and how to get code bases onto your machine, edit them, get them back on GitHub. And you'll be using all of those through the homework throughout this entire course. So if you haven't done lesson 1 yet, definitely want to go back and check that out when we're done. All right, so before we jump into what HTML and CSS actually look like, I need to deal with one more high-level topic, which is text editors. And someone asked about this last night, so we touched on it briefly. So when we write our code, we write it in a text editor. And there are some really simple text editors like Notepad, but we never really use those because there are some great text editors that give us lots of fun, helpful tools. So let me show you Sublime Text, which we saw a little bit of last night. So this is, let me share my screen so you guys can actually see Sublime Text. 1 second. All right. So here we have Sublime Text, as we saw last night. What's really great about an editor like Sublime is we have different keywords lit up. Everything's kind of color-coded. There's a lot of techniques for auto-indenting. It's just, even though it's kind of a basic free text editor, it gives us everything we need. So Sublime is really great. It's what I use. There, as I mentioned last night, there are some other great free text editors. The other two I will recommend are Atom and VS Code. So you're welcome to get your hands on any of those. Let me actually post those in the Slack for you guys. So here they are in the Slack channel, which if you're not in Slack, I would recommend you get on Slack because I share useful things in there. So Sublime, Atom, and VS Code, all really great free text editors. For your purposes, those will all be totally suitable. There are also some higher-end text editors that you have to pay for. If you're feeling really enthusiastic, you're welcome to do some research on that. And so now that I have this on screen, I can also talk about some specifics of what we were discussing in the high level yesterday, which is these ideas of syntax, keywords, brackets, and whitespace. So these are all related concepts in how we deal with code. So syntax is essentially punctuation. It's telling us that we have to have this certain kind of bracket. And when we use a keyword like HTML, we have to start with one bracket and end with this. We can also see that down here, which this is actually some CSS, that we're using curly brackets instead. There are some colons, some semicolons. And as we go along in the lesson, I'll get into the details of how to write this code and what each line is doing, what each specific piece of syntax is doing. But right now, the most important takeaway is that code is really specific. There are these really specific rules in terms of how this punctuation is used, how these certain keywords are used. And we have to be able to follow these rules precisely because the computer, even if you almost get it right, the computer has no way of telling. So precision is key. And on that note, I want to remind you guys that memorization is not possible at the very beginning. So I'm going to show you tons of different cool things you can do with these two languages. Don't feel like you have to memorize everything. Our favorite tool in the world as programmers is the Google box. So for example, there's W3 Schools, which is a great online resource for everything we're going to learn tonight. And you can always type in HTML header or, HTML syntax, and a million results are going to come up. So feel free to Google anything you have a question about because that is such a real world skill. And yeah, so big takeaway here is going to be that as we're dealing with computer code, we're going to have to focus on a level of specificity and precision that you might not be used to in just writing, something like English. One other thing I want to mention before we move on is tabbing and whitespace. So there are some exceptions, but almost every language doesn't actually care about tabbing and whitespace. So this could be all on the same line, and as far as the computer is concerned, everything's okay. But we really emphasize tabbing and new lines in programming anyways, because while the computer doesn't care, your fellow developers and your future self will thank you. So I'm going to emphasize as we go along the importance of starting new lines and tabbing so that your code is nice and clean and readable. All right, so that's kind of a high level what are some things to think about as we go along? And now let's shift our focus to HTML and CSS, which are the two languages we're going to talk about tonight. So HTML and CSS are two of the key languages that we use to build web pages. So HTML is all about what is literally on the page. So if I pull up, for example, this W3 school site, we have this logo, we have a menu, we of course have all these words, we have buttons, we have this nav bar over here, there are probably some images, more images. All of these things are put into place using HTML. HTML tells us what is literally on the page. CSS, on the other hand, tells us how it should look. So CSS is telling us this thing up here should be green. These things should be stacked in this way. This bit of text should be more centered. These buttons should be gray. This CSS heading should be big, whereas this header down here is kind of medium biggish, whereas everything on the side is smaller. All of that style is CSS. So HTML is content, CSS is style. And one really clear way to get an idea of which is which is to actually remove the CSS. So over here, I have taken Google, a website we are all familiar with, and I've removed the CSS. So we can see that everything we expect is on the page. We have all these links, we have our buttons, we have this image, but they're not styled. They don't look good. They're not where they're supposed to be. So positioning, color, style, all of that is CSS. Another example is Amazon. I've gone ahead and done the same thing to Amazon.com. So we can see that, once again, all the content is on the page, but it looks pretty bad. It looks kind of like a website from the mid-90s. So that should give us kind of a starter intuition as to what is HTML versus CSS. So let's go ahead and look at that code base again so that we can get a little bit of an idea of how it's actually written. So let me pull that back up for you guys. Okay, so here is a bit of HTML code. So the first thing we want to do when we're writing HTML code is start to put everything in boxes. So we have this div element, which is our biggest box. So think of this as a box where everything on our page is contained. And then inside of that, we have a smaller box, which is going to be a heading containing some content. Next to that, another box. And really, we're just kind of putting these elements on the page nestled in each other. So let me go ahead and diagram that out because I think it might make more sense in that way. So let me pull up my whiteboard here. So when making a web page, you might start by saying, okay, this is going to be a container for all of my heading related material. So you create this container or element that's essentially just a box. And then maybe you put another box up here, and this is your main heading. And this one actually has content. So it could say, I'm going to do squiggles, but this is the heading for our website. And maybe below that, we want a little subheading. So we create another container for that. I apologize that my boxes are so squiggly. I'm really bad at drawing straight. And then there's some text in here. So we can see that some of these HTML elements are meant just to contain content, to contain words or text in this case. Whereas some HTML elements, such as this one out here, are meant just to hold other things inside of it. And so this is kind of the heading section of our website. And then maybe down here, we have another big container. And let's say that this is containing a bunch of photos. So perhaps we have a photo here, So I'll just draw some little, there's a nice little sun in this one. Maybe a flower in this one. And some arbitrary cloud squiggles over here. Isn't my art amazing? And then maybe there's a caption underneath each photo that contains some text. So the takeaway here is that when we're thinking about a web page from an HTML perspective, we're really just thinking about boxes that contain other boxes that contain content. And this is an extremely simple web page, but when you think about something like Facebook, there's going to be an incredible amount of boxes within boxes within boxes within boxes. So over here is kind of a visual sense of what's happening, whereas in the code, it starts to get pretty abstract. So before I dive any deeper into the code, let me show you another example of this, just to give you a better idea. So let's pull up, let's go ahead and I'm going to refresh this so we have our style back. So I can go ahead and actually inspect the elements and look at the HTML piece by piece. So we can see that there's this big, what's glowing blue right now is a big box that every single thing inside of Google is contained in. And inside of that, we have, let's go down. There's this box that contains the search bar and the search buttons. There is a, not find in the image, but it's somewhere in there. And then within that, we can see that we can break it down even smaller into the box containing the search bar. The actual buttons themselves are somewhere in here. Oop. Maybe I shouldn't have done Google because it's really complicated. Come on. Well, somewhere in here we can find the buttons. Aha. I think I found them. Oop. Well, I'm having trouble finding the buttons, but I could do this and yeah. All right, well, I'm gonna slightly give up on this because it's turning out to be maybe more complicated and less helpful than I'd hoped. But hopefully just going through Google a little bit inside of this element inspector has shown you that as diagrammed over on the whiteboard, these everyday websites that you're used to using are just a bunch of boxes within boxes containing buttons and content and search bars and images and all that fun stuff. So let's not waste any more time and let's look at some actual code. So pulling up Sublime Text again, here is the most abstract version of everything we've been talking about, which is the code itself. So we can see that this element is one box containing two smaller elements. And then we have this element here, which once again contains two smaller elements. And all of that is contained in this one big element. And so this is another example of why tabbing is so important, because the fact that I've tabbed my HTML code lets us very easily see, okay, we've got one big container, we have two medium-sized containers, and then within them we have two smaller elements. All right. So let's go ahead and start writing some of our own HTML. So I'm going to use something throughout this entire course called CodePen. I will send you guys that link. It's pretty easy to remember, but I'll send you that link in Slack just in case. And so CodePen is what's called a sandbox environment. That essentially means it's something designed to help us write code more easily. So over here in Sublime, I'm writing code exactly the way I would in a production setting. I'm just writing it straight into my text editor. And that's good for actually developing projects, but it doesn't really give us immediate feedback about what we're creating. Whereas CodePen itself is actually designed to give us immediate feedback. So if I go ahead and write an HTML element, it's going to immediately appear on the screen. So over here, it'll show us what our code would look like in the web browser. So let's talk about what I just did. So I created an HTML element, and that's a term I've been throwing around a lot, and it basically just means some sort of container or box. And the div element is the most general thing. It's often used as kind of a meta box to contain smaller pieces. It's really just the most basic thing. So I've created my div. The keyword for that is div. And whenever you create a new element, you just put the name of the element in these little pointy brackets. And then you put the content inside. And then at the end, you close up your element. So that is the exact same syntax as opening it, but with this little slash in there. So this is really just the syntax for HTML. It's almost, there are some other complications that we'll see later, but it's almost just this simple. You need a type of element in these little brackets, then you can put content inside it, and then you close it up at the end. So as I mentioned, divs are usually these meta containers that contain smaller elements. So instead of putting that hello in there, let's go ahead and create something called a P. So I've created my opener and my closer. Usually you type them all at once, otherwise you might forget to close your element. And so P is for paragraph. As you might expect, a paragraph is just a chunk of text. So there you go. We now have two elements on screen. The divider, which is kind of this meta element holding more stuff, and inside that, a paragraph. And it's kind of hard to see them, right? Because there's no real lines going around them telling us what's where, but they exist. Let me show you something else. It's called a span. Okay, so now I have two elements inside of my divider. The first one is this paragraph. The second one is a span. So both paragraphs and spans contain text. And at first glance, it might seem like they're doing kind of the same thing. But let me show you one way that they're different. So if I do another span, let's close that up. So notice that span 1 and span 2 appear right next to each other on screen. That is not what's going to happen if I do two paragraphs. So one difference between paragraphs and spans is that paragraphs automatically start a new line when we create them, whereas spans are what we call inline. I could just keep creating spans and they would all be next to each other as long as there's room on the page. And we'll be talking about this a bit tonight and tomorrow, which is that these elements all have some automatic styles that are put on them that help differentiate them from each other. So one thing that is automatically formatted with paragraphs is that there is a new line when you create a new paragraph, whereas spans are automatically formatted to be inline, to appear on the line next to each other. So divs, spans, and paragraphs are all really basic. You know, in terms of just putting text on the screen, they're the way to go. Divs are usually going to be used to contain things like paragraphs and spans. And then paragraphs are used when we want text that exists separately on its own line. Spans are used when we want something that's kind of floating in line with everything. Let me show you one more element, which is the header. Well, actually, very different headers. So headers are used with H and then a number. As you might imagine, headers are, well, they're headers. And there is an H1 through H5. In terms of automatic formatting, as you can see, header 1 is going to be the biggest, Header 2, the next big. Let's go ahead and throw an H5 in just for fun. And then header 5 is pretty small. It's actually even smaller than some of this other text we have. But even though that's the automatic styling and formatting that's put on these elements, I wouldn't think about them in terms of size. So in the real world, we always set things like size up in CSS because that's a styling-based decision. So really you want to think about these different headers as being significant in terms of importance. So H1 should be the most important text. H2 should be still important text, but maybe slightly important. And this is actually functionally relevant that you choose the correct H tag, because, for example, one of the ways that Google figures out which websites are relevant is based on the headers. So if I search something that completely matches a website's H1, a search engine like Google would be like, hey, this is a good result. Whereas if I search for something that matches something in the H5, it might not come up so quickly. So when you're designing your websites, definitely think about these H1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in terms of how important is this heading text. All right, so these are some really basic elements here. And if we go back over to that code base we were looking at before, you might see some of these guys over here. So I've got in this code base a couple dividers, a couple headers, a paragraph, and an image. What a good opportunity for us to talk about images. So images are self-closing. So we've seen with everything I've put up here so far that we actually have to write out an opening tag and a closing tag. Images are kind of cool in that they just close automatically. So let me grab us an image. One moment. All right. And notice that the image appears on the same line as the spans because spans do not create new lines. So now I've put in an image, and this thing looks a little more complicated than what we've seen so far. So image has what is called an attribute. It's this SRC, which stands for source. So in addition to having the tag name, which is MIG, image, we also put in this thing called source, an equal sign, and then we have a link to the image. So whenever you want to put an image in, you need either a local copy of the image saved on your machine, or you need an actual URL where the image lives at. And you can link that into the source, close it up, and then you have an image on your screen. So that is an example of a self-closing tag. Most HTML tags require an explicit closer, but there are some exceptions like this image. Okay. Let's talk about a couple other cool elements. So the next thing I want to show you guys is an anchor tag. So an anchor tag is a link. I'm going to go ahead and put this in a new div so that it's on its own line. So this is a anchor tag or a link. And right now it says click me, but it doesn't seem to be clickable. And where would it go if we clicked it anyways? Well, anchors are kind of like images in that they require an attribute so that we can specify where they lead. So href is the attribute that we use for a link. So if I did this, and when it hadn't put in a URL into the href, now it is clickable. Should be clickable. That's weird. Shouldn't make a difference. All right, well, we will come back to that one. It might just be something weird with the sandbox environment. That does happen occasionally. So, but this is the idea with an anchor tag, is that so images have sources, anchors have hrefs. So we have images and links, slightly more complicated because we're now dealing with this attribute, but still this kind of basic idea of we just create a new element. The next thing I want to introduce to you guys is a list. So we have two types of lists in what in the world is going on, CodePen? All right, so sorry about that. We have two types of lists in HTML, ordered lists and unordered lists. So let's start with an unordered list, which is usually what we're using. So that element is called UL for unordered list. And then you need to create list items, which is LI. So lists actually require two different elements to create. So let me just throw a few more of these on here, and then we'll break down what's going on. All right. So you create this first element, the UL, to let the code know that we're starting a list. And then every single individual item needs a separate LI element. So these two elements together create the list. As you'll notice, ULs are auto-formatted to have these bullet points, which every developer removes. And if we go over to the well, I don't think there were any on here. But back in the, I don't know if you remember, back in the unstyled version of Google, you could actually see some of these bullets appear. So unordered lists automatically have bullets, but we like to get rid of those. The other type of list is an ordered list. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy over the same list items in here. As you see, the ordered list automatically gives the items numbers instead of bullets. And once again, really similar syntax going on here. We start with the OL element, the unordered list element, which tells our computer, okay, we're about to create a list, and then each item has a list item element. So functionally, we usually use the unordered list in the real world because we generally don't have bullets or numbers that are automatically being created. We'd like to control that style ourselves using CSS, but it's good to know both of them. So just as a little reminder of everything we've seen, we've learned a few different HTML elements. We've looked at divs, which are, oh, someone suggested that I might not have closed. I have closed my A tag, so I don't think that's what's going on. If anyone else does have any suggestions about why my link isn't working, I'm happy to hear. Oh, it works when I do. So if I do open a new tab, it opens up over here. I think that CodePen might just be preventing a redirect, which is why it wasn't opening automatically. In fact, I think there might be a pop-up was blocked over there thing. So, but yes, A's do actually work. Just sometimes sandboxes are amazing because they let us see what we're doing on screen so easily, but they also sometimes have weird controls where things don't work the way they would in the real world. All right, let me go back to reviewing what we just learned. So divs are these kind of high-level elements that we use to just kind of clump-like things together. Within those, we might have headers, which we use 1 through 5. Okay. Leanne has informed me how to get around the CodePen issue. So there is one more I'm sorry, I keep interrupting myself. There's one more attribute that I'm going to throw in here. So you can also do a attribute called target, which you can set to blank. And what that and this works outside of CodePen, and this just says that this link should open the source page in a different window. So if we click it now, it pops open. So this is something that's commonly used, is this target blank, if you want your user to not be redirected when they click a link. But outside of CodePen, writing it like this also will totally work if you would prefer your website to function in a way where you click the link and you are redirected. So that is a good thing to know about CodePen. All right, so back to our review. So we've learned about headers, which are exactly what they sound like. There's 1 through 5, and you want to think about those as being a signifier of importance, not size, because size we can style later. We have paragraphs, which are chunks of text that start on new lines. Spans, which are chunks of text which appear in line next to each other. We can also create images, which require a source attribute to tell us what image we want to appear. We have anchor tags, which require an href attribute, and that tells us where this link should go. And in CodePen, we should use our target attribute. And then finally, I showed you 2 different lists, unordered lists and ordered lists, both which contain these list items. So this is, in terms of writing code in CodePen, this is all you need to know to get off the ground. But as I said, sandboxes are kind of double-edged swords where they make life easy, but sometimes they make life too easy. And there's actually something going on behind the scenes in real HTML pages that's a little more complicated. So I'm going to switch us away from CodePen for just a second so I can talk about the head and the body. So over here in Sublime Text, we can see that if we just look at this code, this looks a lot like what I just wrote. We have divs, headers, paragraphs, images, but there's some other stuff going on that doesn't maybe look so familiar. So on the highest level, we first of all need an HTML tag. So everything exists, everything always in an HTML page exists inside an HTML tag. The only reason we didn't use that in CodePen is because it does it for us. So that's really nice for just getting examples up on the page, but it also allows us to kind of skip over a fundamental, which is not so good. So at the top of every HTML page, we first want to specify the doc type, which will tell our web browser, okay, we're dealing with HTML. So this thing looks the same on every HTML page. It always is at the top. Then we need to create an HTML tag. So everything else is going to be contained in this HTML tag. And this isn't something that per se physically appears on the screen the way, you know, a header would, but it's important for kind of the meta content. Speaking of meta content, the next thing we need is a head. So the head tag really is for meta content. So none of these things in the head have physical boxes that appear on the screen, but they're all important. For example, the title tells us what actually appears up in this tab. So for example, Google's page in this title section has Google, which is why that appears up there. This is also where we link in our style sheets, which I will go over later. So there's going to be this head section, which contains all the metadata. And then after the head comes the body. The body contains the actual content. So what we have over here in CodePen really is just the body of our page. And there's some other stuff that goes on behind the scenes that we need. So when we're in CodePen messing around, we don't have to worry about the HTML tag or the head or the doc type. But when we're writing actual code in our text editors, those things are important. So I wanted to go over them with you. The final thing I want to draw your attention to, which I mentioned already, is this W3 Schools page. So this is like the Bible for HTML and CSS. So there are tons of online resources, but this really should be your starting point. So I'm going to go ahead and Slack, I would definitely be using this for your homework. So for example, if you open the home page, it starts with this nifty little HTML example, which breaks down everything we just saw. We have our HTML tag, we have our title, our body. So this is a really great point of reference for how this stuff should work. And if we go into Learn HTML, there's probably way more than we need right now, but we can see elements, and some of the things we've already covered are on here. So anything you need to reference that we went over is going to be in this W3 Schools page. Okay, so let's move on to CSS. So as I mentioned, CSS is the style. So what we've done over here is we've put some great items on the page, but it totally looks bad, right? Nothing is formatted, there's no color, everything is just kind of awkwardly on the page. This link looks super 90s. It looks like this, Amazon page over here where I've taken off all the style. So how do we make it look pretty? Well, we use CSS. So let's start by talking about how CSS and HTML talk to each other. So whenever you pull up a web page, you're essentially, when you actually type something in to the URL box, like google.com, what you're requesting is the HTML page. So on the most basic level, when you go to a URL, you are asking for all the HTML content. And that's good because we need the HTML content. But we also want some other stuff, including the CSS. But we have to ask for it specifically. So this brings me back to this example. So in order to get style, in order to get CSS somewhere on our HTML page, we need to ask for our style. One way we can do it, which I have right here, is we can actually write our style in directly. So inside of our head, we can do something that's called a style tag. Once again, this has an opening and closing tag. And inside of that, we can start to write CSS. So this is a little weird because though this is an HTML file, these lines I have highlighted are actually CSS. And you can kind of tell, right? Because HTML has this very specific syntax with these kind of pointy brackets and everything has an opening and closing tag. But this code kind of looks different. All of a sudden, we have curly brackets, we have colons and semicolons. That's a good clue that we're dealing with a different language. So while this is an option for how to write CSS, we never really do this in the real world. This is a good way to just get some CSS into your file from the get-go without doing much work, but it's really not a good way to do it in the real world because we always want to keep our HTML in our HTML file and CSS in our CSS file. So let's go ahead and delete that because even though it works, it's not ideal. So really we want a separate file that has all of our CSS in it. So now our HTML page only contains HTML, our styles page only contains CSS. But as I mentioned, when I go to google.com, I'm only requesting the HTML file. So how do we get these styles? Well, there's something called a link tag. And by the way, you guys, every single language has a way of commenting in and out code. So these little arrows over here are HTML's way of keeping the code commented out. So as long as code is commented out, it's physically there, but it's going to be ignored. So now that I commented in, it is no longer going to be ignored. So I have commented in a link element. And this is the strongly preferred way of connecting a style sheet to an HTML page. So you have your link element. We have several attributes. The rel equals style sheet is, you're always going to have this in here if you're linking in a style sheet. Type, text CSS, once again, you always want these two things. So every single style sheet will have these two attributes that looking exactly this way. And then finally an href, which we already saw in the anchor tag. So the href is linking to styles.css. So whereas over here, we saw our anchor tag linking to an actual website. In this, we're linking to a file. So it's just saying, look for a file in the same folder called styles.css, which exists. So we have linked in our style sheet. So this is how we get our style sheet to actually appear when we pull up our web page. Of course, CodePen, being a sandbox environment, does all the heavy lifting for us. So everything is already linked in. All we have to do is start writing CSS. So let's write some CSS. So the first thing we do is we select something we want to style, and this is called a selector. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of the spans on my page. So I just write span, and then some of these curly brackets. So everything inside the curly brackets is going to style our spans. So inside of here, we have these property value pairs. So there are a bunch of set properties we can do. So if we go over here and let's actually go to CSS, and we have just a big list of properties somewhere. Property reference, perfect. So this is every single property we could put. There's tons of stuff we can do in CSS. We don't have to worry about all this right now, but it is here if you want to look at it. So one basic property we can start with is color. So now we have taken all of our spans and changed the text color to red. So we have property, colon, value, semicolon. Let's look at another one. How about background color? This thing is going to be atrocious, by the way. Now it's really easy to see where these actual span elements exist. And I'm going to go ahead and select our P's as well. So, and I'll do background color for them. Let's do purple. And this also gives us a way of seeing a little more clearly the difference between spans and P's. Whereas P's take up the entire line, even a really short P, or a P that has a really short amount of text, the P element itself is going to take up the whole line, whereas spans are just going to be a lot smaller. And we'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow night. So we have color, background color. We can also mess with our font size. All of a sudden our spans get way bigger. We could do, we're gonna do P's now. We can do things like height and width. This ugly website is just getting worse. Let's see. So now we've auto set our height and width on those paragraphs. We can add borders. So let me actually select something else just to keep things convoluted. So border is a little different because it actually requires several values. So border, we want the thickness in pixels, the style, so we could do solid, dashed, or a few others. You can look it up on W3. And then the color. So that could be red. Use it. So borders are definitely an option. We can do, as I showed you, we can do, let me see. Actually, that is all I'm going to show you for now. We do have an option for background image, and that is part of the homework, but I'm going to go ahead and leave that as a challenge to you guys to use your online tools and W3 to figure out how to set a background image. So this is more style-based. There's also things we can do with positioning. So I want to introduce you guys to something called the box model. So it's this idea that every single HTML element has this margin, which is kind of the space outside of the element. Then there's a border. Then there's the padding, which is kind of this space inside of it. And then there's content. So let me mess around with margin and padding to show you a little more clearly the difference between the two. So I will do this on our H1. So if I do margin 30 pixels, see how that just jumped away from the side and the top? So our margin is the space outside of the border. If I do padding instead, that's the space inside the border between the border and the actual content. So think about everything as being margin on the outside, then a border, then padding, and then content. And even if these things are set to 0 or there's no border, that's kind of just the model we use to think about every single HTML element. So that is called the box model. And once again, this is all on W3. So don't feel like you need to memorize all this. You will and should look up the syntax for reference as you go along. I still often have to look up the syntax for simple things because I have terrible memory for stuff like that. So don't feel worried at all if you can't memorize all this. All right, so let me talk a little bit more about selectors. So far, we've just been selecting based on the types of elements. And let me get rid of some of the styling because it's pretty ugly. Still pretty bad, but a little better maybe. Okay, so we were selecting all the paragraphs or all the spans or all the headers, and that's nice, but that doesn't give us a ton of control. So there are a couple other ways to select. The first is class. So we can give HTML elements something called a class. So for example, let's say we wanted a class called important. And class names are always something we come up with ourselves. So this could be class blah, 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 but we like to name our classes things that are useful, that our future selves and fellow developers will be able to see. So let's say that our first heading is important content, and then maybe our span down here, first span is also important, and one of these list items is also important. So now we can go ahead down here and select the entire class of important. So whenever we're selecting a class, instead of just typing the name, we type dot class name. And now if we want to do color red, all three of those important items show up red. So in this way, we can style something that's a list item, a span, and a header all using the same bit of CSS. There's another way we can select, and that is with something called an ID. So let's say that we want H5 to be our ID subheading. So the difference between an ID and a class is that classes, multiple items can belong to the same class. An ID is specific to one item. So only one thing can have this ID subheading. And then in that way, we're able to just select subheading. And we use our hash to select IDs. So dot for classes, hash for IDs. And I can make, let's say I want to give my subheading a border. So now I can go ahead and style just this one single element. So this is really great. This really gives us a lot of control. But it also can be a little confusing because we have styles on styles and styles. For example, let's say that our H5 is also important. So now it has a class and an ID, which is totally allowed. And in fact, things can have multiple classes and multiple IDs. I don't know why you would have multiple IDs, but it's pretty common that things will have multiple classes. So notice that now it has this color red from its class and this border green from its ID. But if I go ahead and add color blue down here, we see it's overwritten. So IDs always take precedent over classes. The style in an ID is going to overwrite the style in a class, which will overwrite the style in just a element. So it can get a little confusing when you get into a production code base where there's styles on styles and styles, and it can definitely be tricky to figure out which one is the one that overrides everything else. So specificity is actually a really big topic in CSS that I won't get into in any more detail, but the short way to think about it is IDs are the most important. Anything in an ID styling is going to override something that's styled by a class, which will override something that's styled by just the element. Okay, so that is a little crash course in how we do HTML and CSS. Let me talk really briefly about your homework tonight, and then we will have a little bit of time for questions. So hopefully all of you guys went ahead and used Git to pull down a copy of the pre-course repo yesterday. If you didn't do that, you'll definitely need to do that today. And if you missed the class yesterday, I would go back and watch it so you can learn how to do that. And this is going to be the portal for all your homework. So the lesson 2 homework will be in here. And we're actually going to be messing with some HTML and some CSS. I will say that in this homework, you will be writing in the styles directly into the HTML file. I know I told you that that's not best practice, and it's not, but it's totally fine for just getting some CSS practice for tonight. So did want to mention that everything you need to do is in this README, just creating a bunch of elements and styling them. And then when you're finished with your homework, go ahead and submit a pull request, and a test suite will automatically run and tell you how you did. So if you have any questions about either how to do the homework, where to find the homework, or the homework itself, we will be available in Slack to help you out with that. So we've got just a few minutes left here, but I want to go ahead and open up the floor for questions. So everyone go ahead and post any questions you have in the questions channel. It looks actually like Monica posted something a few minutes ago that said multiple elements can belong to. All right, I'm not sure what Monica was asking specifically. If you're still wondering about IDs and classes, you can go ahead and maybe phrase that a little clearer, but it's about, her question seems to be about multiple elements belonging to the same ID or class. So just to clarify that, for classes, we absolutely can have multiple elements that have the same class. So this span and this H5 and this H1 all are the class important. But IDs are specific. So only this one element can have the ID of subheading. And then on the flip side, elements can also have multiple classes if they want. Kenneth said, are you sure that ID takes priority over class? Yep. So the ID has the color blue, and the class has the color red. And we see that in this element that shares both the ID and the class, that it defaults to the color from the ID. So if I delete this ID color, we'll go ahead and grab the code from the class. But if the ID specifies the color, it's going to look at that first. All right, any other questions out there? Okay, sounds like it's time for us to wrap up for tonight. Well, thank you everybody for learning a little bit about HTML and CSS tonight. I hope you guys feel ready for the homework, and if not, this video will be available on YouTube and will be available in Slack to answer any questions. So go ahead and jump into that, start to get comfortable with this, because tomorrow night we are going to dive quite a bit deeper into CSS and learn how to do lots of cool positioning related things. So I will see you guys then. Have a great night.